The dinner finally ended just after 9:30, but nobody left the table looking relieved. Crystal glasses sat half full beside untouched desserts while rain tapped softly against the tall windows overlooking the dark Connecticut woods surrounding the estate. Harrison rose slowly from his chair at the far end of the table, reaching for his old brown coat without asking permission from anyone in the room. Isabel barely glanced at him. "James can prepare the guest room if you are staying overnight," she said politely, though her tone carried the same warmth as a bank receipt. Harrison looked toward the fireplace instead of at her. "I will manage," he answered quietly before walking toward the hallway beneath the grand staircase. Ethan watched every second of it. Something about Harrison's calm unsettled him more than the tension everybody else seemed desperate to hide. Most men being treated like that would have reacted with anger years ago. Harrison never did. That was what made Ethan uneasy. Upstairs, Eleanor stood alone near the balcony overlooking the dining room, gripping the wooden railing tightly enough for her knuckles to pale beneath the chandelier light. Her breathing looked shallow. David approached her carefully. "Mom, you should get some rest," he said. Eleanor shook her head immediately. "Your father never should have invited him back into this house." David lowered his voice. "Then why does everybody act afraid whenever he walks into a room?" Eleanor looked toward the hallway Harrison disappeared into, and for a brief moment genuine panic crossed her face before she buried it again beneath forced composure. "Because some truths ruin families forever," she whispered. Ethan heard every word from the staircase landing above them. Downstairs, James quietly gathered plates while Thomas loosened his tie near the study doors. Isabel stepped beside him carrying a glass of red wine. "You said the documents were secured," she murmured carefully. Thomas adjusted his glasses. "They were." Isabel's expression hardened almost invisibly. "That is not an answer that comforts me." Before Thomas could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. Harrison crossed the foyer slowly beneath the dim wall sconces, his rough denim shirt standing out against the polished luxury surrounding him. Nobody spoke while he passed. Not Isabel. Not Victoria. Not even Thomas. Ethan noticed it instantly. The entire house seemed to hold its breath around a man everybody claimed no longer mattered. Then Harrison paused beside the old grandfather clock near the staircase and looked directly at Ethan for the first time that night. "You should stop listening from staircases," he said calmly. Ethan froze. Harrison gave the faintest smile before continuing down the dark hallway toward the guest wing. And somehow that quiet warning unsettled Ethan more than if the old man had shouted. Rain continued through the night, wrapping the estate in a cold silence that made the massive hallways feel even larger after midnight. Ethan could not sleep. From the second-floor guest room overlooking the front driveway, he kept replaying Harrison's voice in his head. "You should stop listening from staircases." It was not the words that bothered him. It was the certainty behind them. Harrison had known exactly where he was standing without even looking up. Around 1:15 in the morning, Ethan stepped quietly into the hallway, careful not to wake anyone. The old mansion creaked softly beneath the storm outside, while distant thunder rolled across the Connecticut hills. Most lights had been turned off except for the dim sconces lining the corridor leading toward the study room near the west wing. Ethan stopped halfway down the hall when he noticed a thin line of light beneath the study door. Someone was awake. He moved closer carefully until voices reached him through the heavy wood. "We should have destroyed everything years ago," Isabel whispered sharply. Thomas answered in a lower voice. "Your confidence is becoming dangerous." Isabel let out a frustrated breath. "Do not lecture me now. Harrison should never have come back here." Ethan froze beside the door. He had never heard Isabel sound afraid before. Not once in his life. Through the narrow opening beside the frame, he caught sight of Thomas standing near the fireplace, with a folder tucked beneath his arm, while Isabel paced slowly beside the desk. "If David finds out what happened with the original transfer records, this family collapses overnight," she said. Thomas removed his glasses tiredly. "The problem is not David." Isabel stopped moving. "Then what is the problem?" Thomas hesitated too long before answering. "The problem is that Harrison waited all these years without saying a word. Men like that usually do not return empty-handed." Ethan stepped backward immediately as footsteps echoed from deeper inside the hallway. James appeared carrying fresh towels from the laundry room before noticing Ethan standing near the study. The older man's expression changed instantly. You should not be wandering around this late, James said quietly. Ethan lowered his voice. Why is everybody acting like Harrison is some kind of threat? James looked toward the study door before answering carefully. Because people become frightened when someone survives the lie they built their lives on. Ethan stared at him in confusion. What lie? But James only shook his head. Go to bed, Mr. Ethan. The study door suddenly opened behind them. Isabel stepped into the hallway with her perfect composure already restored, her blonde hair untouched despite the tension moments earlier. Is everything all right? She asked pleasantly. Ethan forced a nod. But before anyone spoke again, another sound carried through the silent mansion. Slow footsteps. Harrison emerged from the darkness at the far end of the corridor wearing the same faded denim shirt, holding an old leather notebook beneath one arm, while his tired eyes settled calmly on the three people standing outside the study. The hallway became completely still the moment Harrison stepped closer beneath the dim amber lights. Rainwater tapped softly against the tall windows at the end of the corridor, while the old grandfather clock downstairs echoed through the mansion with slow mechanical precision. Isabel recovered first. You are awake late, she said smoothly, though her fingers tightened around the stem of her wine glass. Harrison glanced briefly at the study door before answering. Old houses make it difficult to sleep. His calm voice carried no emotion at all. Ethan noticed Thomas immediately shift uncomfortably beside the fireplace inside the study, while James lowered his eyes toward the floor. Nobody wanted to be standing there together. Harrison lifted the worn leather notebook slightly beneath his arm. Funny thing about old houses, he continued quietly. They remember conversations people think disappeared. Isabel forced a small laugh. I think everyone is tired tonight. Harrison nodded once. That is usually when people tell the truth by accident. Silence settled over the hallway again. Ethan could almost feel the tension pressing against the walls around them. Victoria suddenly appeared from the staircase above, wearing a dark silk robe over her evening clothes. Her cold expression sharpening the moment she saw Harrison near the study. What is going on? She asked sharply. Isabel answered immediately. Nothing important. Harrison looked toward Victoria calmly. That family has been saying those exact words for 20 years. Ethan saw something flicker across Victoria's face before it vanished behind her usual composure. Fear again. The same fear James had shown downstairs. Harrison slowly turned toward Ethan. You remind me of your grandfather when he was young, he said. He asked questions everybody else was too afraid to ask. Ethan swallowed carefully. What happened to him? Harrison studied him for a long moment before answering. He trusted the wrong people. Without another word, Harrison walked past them down the corridor toward the guest wing, his boots echoing softly against the marble floor until the darkness swallowed him completely. Nobody moved for several seconds after he disappeared. Then Victoria turned toward Thomas with sudden coldness. You told me everything connected to the transfer was gone. Thomas adjusted his glasses nervously. It should have been. Victoria stepped closer. That answer is becoming very expensive. Ethan watched Isabel carefully now. For the first time since arriving at the estate, her perfect confidence seemed cracked around the edges. She glanced toward the dark hallway. Harrison vanished into before lowering her voice. If he still has copies, we need to know how much. Ethan said nothing, but his pulse quickened. Copies of what? Transfer records. Old conversations. A lie the family built their lives on. Piece by piece, the mansion no longer felt like a home. It felt like a vault holding secrets nobody trusted each other to keep anymore. And somewhere behind those silent walls, Harrison was waiting for someone to finally ask the right question. The breakfast room stayed silent long after David read Isabel's name written across the transfer ledger. Outside the tall windows, fog rolled slowly across the wet lawn while the estate's fountain echoed faintly in the distance. Nobody touched their coffee anymore. David looked up from the documents toward Isabel with confusion that slowly hardened into something far more dangerous. Why is your authorization attached to company transfers from 12 years ago? He asked quietly. Isabel did not panic. She simply folded her hands together on the marble counter and answered with controlled calm. Because your father trusted me. Harrison remained near the fireplace without interrupting. Ethan noticed the old man watching everyone else instead of the ledger itself. Almost like he already knew exactly how each person would react. Thomas stepped forward carefully. David, there are explanations for some of those transactions. Harrison finally spoke. Some. The single word landed heavily in the room. David flipped another page and frowned deeper. These withdrawals happened 6 months before the company blamed Harrison for the financial collapse in Boston. Ethan immediately looked toward Harrison. You were blamed for this. Harrison nodded once. Publicly. David stared at the ledger again, his face pale now. Dad told everyone you nearly destroyed the company. Harrison gave a tired smile that carried no bitterness anymore. That story was useful at the time. Isabel crossed her arms slowly. You disappeared for years, Harrison. Nobody forced you to leave. Harrison looked directly at her. People leave quietly when they realize the family already decided who should carry the blame. The room fell still again. Ethan suddenly understood why nobody ever spoke about Harrison growing up. He had not simply been ignored. He had been erased. Eleanor entered the breakfast room at that moment wearing the same pastel cardigan from the night before. The second she saw the ledger open on the table, all color drained from her face. Put that away, she whispered immediately. David looked toward her in disbelief. Mom, did you know about this? Eleanor's eyes moved toward Harrison before dropping to the floor. That silence answered everything. David pushed back from the table abruptly and walked toward the windows, breathing heavily through his nose while rainwater still clung to the glass outside. All these years, he muttered. Isabel approached him carefully. David, you are reacting emotionally. He turned toward her sharply. Emotionally? He held up the ledger in disbelief. My entire life has apparently been built on paperwork I never even saw. Thomas loosened his tie again, visibly sweating now despite the cold room. Ethan noticed Harrison quietly collecting the remaining folders back into the cardboard box. Calm, patient, almost gentle, like a man who understood that truth did not need shouting once people finally started reading it themselves. The mansion remained tense for the rest of the afternoon, its massive rooms filled with the kind of silence wealthy families mistake for control. David locked himself inside his father's old office overlooking the back gardens, while Isabel spent nearly an hour on private phone calls behind closed doors. Ethan wandered through the estate, unable to shake the feeling that every hallway held conversations people did not want overheard. Around 4 o'clock, he found Eleanor sitting alone in the sunroom wrapped in a pale gray blanket despite the warmth inside. Rain clouds still drifted low across the Connecticut hills beyond the glass walls, turning the afternoon lights silver and cold. Eleanor stared at the gardens without speaking until Ethan finally sat across from her. Did Harrison really take the blame for all of it? He asked quietly. Eleanor closed her eyes for several seconds before answering. Your grandfather built this family around reputation, she said softly. Back then, losing money mattered less than losing public trust. Ethan frowned. So they blamed Harrison to protect the company? Eleanor's hands trembled slightly against the blanket. At first, everyone believed it would only be temporary. Ethan leaned forward. But it was not temporary. Eleanor looked toward the fountain outside. No, the word barely escaped her lips. Ethan studied her carefully. For the first time in his life, she did not look like the composed matriarch of the Harrison estate. She looked tired, fragile, like someone who had spent decades carrying a secret too heavy to survive forever. Why did Harrison come back now? Ethan asked. Eleanor gave a faint, painful smile. Because your grandfather is dying. Ethan froze. What? Eleanor finally turned toward him. Thomas Harrison signed new inheritance revisions 3 weeks ago. Harrison found out. Suddenly, everything clicked together in Ethan's mind. The tension, the transfer records, the panic in Isabel's voice. This was not about the past anymore. It was about what happened next. Before Ethan could ask another question, footsteps approached through the hallway. Sophia Bennett entered the sunroom carrying a leather briefcase, her dark coat still damp from outside. Ethan recognized her immediately from corporate events in Boston. Young, sharp, calm. Harrison followed a few seconds behind her with the same quiet expression he always carried. Eleanor's face immediately tightened with alarm. You should not have brought her here, she whispered toward Harrison. Sophia set the briefcase gently onto the glass table. I came because Mr. Cole asked me to review the inheritance documents signed last month. Ethan looked between them in confusion. You are a lawyer? Sophia nodded once. And after reading what your family filed recently, I think somebody inside this house became very nervous about what Harrison might still know. Harrison remained standing near the windows overlooking the gray estate grounds. People rewrite history when they think the original witnesses are gone, he said quietly. Then he looked directly at Eleanor. The problem is that I never disappeared as completely as they hoped. Nobody at the table moved after Harrison placed the cassette recorder beneath the chandelier light. The soft crackling from the fireplace and the distant wind outside became the only sounds inside the enormous dining room. David stared at the recorder as though it might explode if touched. Isabel sat perfectly still beside him, but Ethan noticed her fingers trembling faintly against the stem of her wine glass for the first time since this nightmare began. Harrison slowly pushed the recorder toward the center of the table. "Go ahead," he said quietly. "You deserve to hear it yourself." David looked toward Eleanor first. She lowered her eyes immediately, unable to meet his gaze anymore. That silence told him everything before the tape even started. With a shaking hand, David pressed play. Static filled the room for several seconds before an older voice emerged through the speaker. "Thomas Harrison. Weak from age, but unmistakable. The board will survive if somebody accepts responsibility publicly." Another voice followed. "Thomas the lawyer. Younger. Nervous. Harrison refuses to sign the statement." Then came Victoria's voice, cold and sharp even decades earlier. "Then make it impossible for him to stay." Ethan felt his stomach tighten. Nobody at the table breathed. The recording continued. Papers shuffled faintly in the background before Isabel's younger voice entered carefully. "David cannot inherit a damaged company. If Harrison leaves quietly, the family survives." David's face lost all color. Across the table, Harrison never looked away from him. The tape ended with Thomas Harrison speaking one final exhausted sentence. "Sometimes families survive by sacrificing the child nobody values enough to protect." Silence swallowed the room completely after the recorder clicked off. Eleanor covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. Thomas removed his glasses slowly, unable to look at anyone anymore. Victoria remained frozen beside the fireplace like stone finally beginning to crack. David stood abruptly from the table and stepped backward, staring at Isabel in disbelief. "You knew?" he whispered. Isabel opened her mouth carefully. "David, listen to me. You knew." His voice broke harder this time. Harrison remained seated at the far end of the table exactly where the family had always placed him. The unwanted seat. The forgotten seat. The seat belonging to the man they believed would never matter again. Ethan looked toward Harrison differently now. Not with pity. Not with suspicion. With understanding. Harrison had not returned to destroy the family. The family had already done that themselves years ago. He only returned so the truth would no longer die quietly inside those walls. After several long seconds, Harrison finally stood from his chair and buttoned his old denim coat slowly. "I did not come back for revenge," he said calmly. "I came back because lies eventually become inheritance." Nobody stopped him as he walked away from the table. Not Isabel. Not Victoria. Not Thomas. David remained standing beneath the chandelier in stunned silence while Eleanor quietly cried into trembling hands. Ethan watched Harrison disappear down the long hallway toward the front doors of the mansion, and for the first time in his life, the oldest man in the house no longer looked invisible.